Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Transverse News, your weekly news source here for trans and LGBT news on the Transverse. First off, we jump over to the UK as it was named one of the world's least friendly countries for trans people. Nothing surprising per se, because of all the things we've been talking about, but the British are among the least supportive of trans people, a new survey of 30 countries has revealed. The Ipsos LGBT Plus Pride 2023 survey, which asked questions of more than 22,000 adults, found that while a majority of Britons agree that trans people face discrimination, they are more mixed in their support for gender affirming care. The survey was conducted by Ipsos on its Global Advisor online platform in February and March and surveyed 22,514 adults under the age of 75, including 1,000 Brits. Support for gender affirming care in UK was near the bottom of the list, with less than half, 47%, of the population who were surveyed believing teens should have access to care such as hormone replacement treatment. Just two countries were lower: the United States, 45%, ouch, and Hungary, 36%. When asked about if insurance companies should cover the cost of transitioning, just 36% of Britons agreed, putting them fourth from the bottom in terms of support. Only Romania, South Korea, and Hungary were lower on this topic. Those surveyed were also asked if they agreed or disagreed with governments adding an additional marker to official documents outside the male and female binary. Again, just 47% of British people agreed with that suggestion. In terms of trans people being able to use single-sex spaces which align with their gender, such as public toilets, Great Britain was once again near the bottom of the pile. Only 40% of those surveyed agreed, with 40% disagreeing, and the remainder unsure. The only country to score lower was the United States, with 40% of Americans in favor, but 45% disagreeing. So this is what happens when you write a headline before reading into the story, because the UK is not the worst. We are. We hold that mantle. Yay. Judge Thomas Parker, an appointee of Donald Trump, has struck down the first law banning drag. Recently signed into law, Tennessee's Adult Entertainment Act outlawed performance by someone dressed as the opposite sex from their birth in public spaces where children were or could be present, including government buildings and libraries. It labeled those performances as adult performances, thus making them illegal to have families and children there. This didn't only apply to drag shows and drag story hours. Because of its vague writing, it encompassed trans performers and actors portraying the opposite sex in plays. In his 70-page ruling, Judge Parker stated that the law was both unconstitutionally vague and substantially overbroad. Where the AEA describes content as harmful to minors, Judge Parker stated that the, quote, standard applies to minors of all ages, so it fails to provide fair notice of what is prohibited, and it encourages discriminatory enforcement. He also stated that the AEA is substantially overbroad because it applies to public property or anywhere a minor could be present. The ruling concluded that the law fails strict scrutiny review. Aaron in the Morning is reporting that as Pride Month began, Elon Musk announced his intention to use his immense wealth to lobby for the criminalization of gender-affirming care. Not satisfied to simply throw his money away by ruining the integrity of Twitter, Musk set his sights on attacking marginalized folks by fighting to ban the care that they need. In a tweet, Musk declared that trans healthcare, quote, is a major problem, unquote, and promised to actively lobby to criminalize the life-saving care supported by science and most major medical institutions, which he calls, quote, severe, irreversible changes to children. If you've been watching this show for a while now, you may remember that I did some rough math based on the average cost of a house in the United States and the estimates of our homeless population, and found that with the recent, at the time, announcement of Musk's wealth, if he had used his money to buy houses for all of our homeless, when he was done, he'd still be one of the richest men in the country. But not interested in doing good, he'd rather focus his energy on following false and hateful rhetoric and join the fight against the legal rights of trans people. So, one of the biggest weapons in our arsenal against anti-trans legislation is proving to be Republican lawmakers themselves. According to reporting by Aaron Reed of Aaron in the Morning, statements made by Republican lawmakers about the trans community and why they feel bans are justified in their bills, those words are being used to prove the true discrimination behind the legislation. In a lawsuit challenging Idaho's HB 71, a ban on gender-affirming care for transgender minors, attorneys from the ACLU and other firms illustrated the importance of paying attention to and recording the statements made by the legislators on the floor, as well as in their social media feeds. The court filing presented the right-wing dog whistles used, like calling gender care for minors, quote, mutilation, along with mischaracterizations and falsehoods, claiming that we're facing an epidemic of transgender ideology that must be stopped. The lawsuit also pointed to the abundant opposition to the ban shown in public testimony against the bill and the medical evidence and testimonies from doctors, youth, and families, which was all ignored. The lawyers demonstrated mischaracterizations by lawmakers, including sponsor of the bill, Representative Bruce Skog, calling trans care mutilation, a term that Reed points out would not be used to describe other surgeries performed daily without fanfare. They also called out the fact that Skog and others regularly conflated surgical procedures, mutilation in their words, used to treat trans adults with the care being given to youth in the form of puberty blockers and occasionally hormone replacement therapy. Also presented in evidence in the case were official government social media posts from Senator Tammy Nichols claiming that the LGBTQ plus community was, again, an epidemic, and stated that states need to control the spread. The legal filing concludes by stating the ways that the legislation is discriminatory and unconstitutional, including violating citizens' rights to equal protection and the right to due process as it relates to parental rights to make the medical care decisions they feel are appropriate for their family and their children. On June 8th, the U.S. Justice Department filed federal criminal charges against Donald Trump over the mishandling of classified documents and obstructing justice by not handing them over, then trying to hide some of the documents. Where it gets really disturbing is when he makes the statement, "I'll never leave." Trump's latest statement is the thing that I've personally sensed and feared most all along. People have called Trump an autocrat, and there is a good deal of evidence that this is his inclination, but none of those pieces of evidence are quite as strong and as clear as that statement. It is my deep-rooted belief and fear that if Trump were elected again, he would ramp up his efforts to remain in office and, like he says, never leave. Trump is not legally prohibited from running for president, however, whether it be from prison or as a convicted felon, but such a bid would nevertheless provide a massive stress test for the country's political and legal systems. Moving back into Florida, parents' rights groups are being labeled extremist. SPLC lists a key Florida group as anti-government. The Southern Poverty Law Center is, for the first time, labeling Florida headquartered Moms for Liberty and 11 other right-wing parents' rights groups as extremist groups in its annual report, which was released on Tuesday. Moms for Liberty and the other organizations are being designated as, quote, anti-government extremist groups based on longstanding criteria as explained by the Law Center's Intelligence Project Director, Susan Cork. Cork said the grassroots conservative groups are part of a new front in the battle against inclusivity in schools, though they are drawing from ideas rooted in age-old white supremacy. The movement is primarily aimed at not wanting to include our hard history, topics of racism, and very strong push against teaching anything having to do with LGBTQ plus topics in schools, Cork said. We saw this in a very deliberate strategy to go to the local level. The new designations are detailed in the Law Center's annual 2022 Year in Hate and Extremism report. Speaking of extremism, hate, and mouthpieces, Matt Walsh is up to his old BS again. This time, instead of attacking the trans community, he is directing his attacks at the healthcare providers that support us. And he's doing it with more of his usual lies. He sent a producer in to give a convincingly unmasculine performance and lie to medical staff at Folx and Plume to obtain a letter of approval for an orchiectomy, and then tries to use that as proof that these organizations are corrupt. The only thing, in fact, that Matt Walsh has proven here is, as he continues to grasp for gotcha journalism, is to show that if you go to a doctor and lie about your symptoms, lie about the medication you're taking, and lie about the previous medical diagnoses you've received, that you can get approval for surgery. This is so far from news and so far from a true expose that I'm not really going to spend much time on this story. I just want to know when Matt Walsh is going to come to information without having to lie first to get it. He lied to people to get them to participate in his What is a Woman mockumentary, which itself contains lies and false claims, including the BS about litter boxes in schools. Now he's got a video of a producer of his lying to medical professionals to get approval for a surgery and trying to turn around and say that it's proof that the system is somehow a racket. Louisiana lawmakers have sent a package of anti-LGBTQ bills to the Democratic governor for his signature, including a ban on gender-affirming care for trans youth. The proposed laws, which include an imitation of Florida's Don't Say Gay bill, passed through a final vote by the House on Tuesday, June 6th. The bill banning gender-affirming care, House Bill 648, has caused controversy over the past few months after it was originally struck down by a House committee by just one Republican vote. Pharmacist and Republican Senator Fred Mills argued that the bill, which would impose sanctions on those prescribing potentially life-saving health care to under 18s, is unnecessary, and he trusted the physicians making their testimony and then trusted them in the field to make the right decisions. I always, in my heart of hearts, have believed that a decision would be made by a patient and a physician, he said. He had also said when we covered the story that the evidence didn't back up what people were claiming in the bill and in the ramp up to the bill, and that the facts of the case of what was claimed in the bill was contrary to what was proven, was that gender-affirming care is helpful. It's not the harmful thing that they say it was. A group of state Republicans reissued the bill for consideration by the Senate Judiciary, which passed it in a 6-minute hearing on June 2nd. Governor John Bell Edwards has not explicitly stated whether he intends to sign the new bills into law, but has signaled his opposition to anti-LGBT legislation in the past. So there is still hope. HB 648 would effectively ban physically reversible puberty blockers from trans youth by threatening the removal of the medical licenses of those who prescribe them, as well as leaving them open to potential lawsuits. And again, this is another one of those bills that we've seen that's written very vaguely, so it has the effect of banning the care because the caregivers themselves are unsure if they're safe in providing the care, and thus they step back from it. Let's go over to Kentucky now, as a dispute erupts over a section of Kentucky's transgender law. A new dispute has erupted revolving around one word in a section banning sex education topics, including sexual orientation, from discussion in classrooms. The measure's top Republican sponsor pushed back this week over how the Kentucky Department of Education has interpreted the provisions in offering guidance to school districts statewide. It's part of a far-reaching measure passed this year to regulate some of the most personal aspects of life for transgender youth in Kentucky, from banning access to gender-affirming healthcare to restricting the bathrooms they can use at school. The ban on gender-affirming care has drawn a court challenge. The latest dispute boils down to a single word choice by lawmakers. They used or rather than and in the sex education section, leading to big implications over how it's interpreted. As a result, districts can choose one of two bans in the section according to the guidance. Districts can choose between prohibiting all mention of gender identity and sexual orientation across all grades, or waiting to discuss human sexuality until 6th grade, education department officials have said. That's not what lawmakers intended, Republican Senator Max Wise said Wednesday, calling it an absurd interpretation and a feeble attempt to undermine the measure. Supporters wanted the law to do both things, he said. Obviously, the legislature would not pose these two requirements, which protect children and protect parental rights, as a binary choice for school systems to select to enforce. A new survey finds that Americans are now less supportive of trans athletes playing on the team of their choice. Driving the news, 69% of Americans said transgender athletes should only be allowed to compete on sports teams that conform with their birth gender, per Gallup's annual Values and Beliefs poll conducted in May, compared to 62% in 2021. So we've slipped by 7%. Similarly, fewer people, 26%, endorse transgender athletes being allowed to play on teams that match their current gender identity, down from 34%. So a similar drop, but when you're talking 34% to begin with, it's it's it has a bigger impact. The big picture. The debate regarding trans athletes' participation in sports is largely viewed around competitive fairness rather than transgender civil rights, per Gallup. Most of the objections are centered on the belief by some that trans women retain an unfair advantage even after taking hormones to lower their testosterone, though the science on that is inconclusive, Axios' Ina Fried reports. Meanwhile, the Department of Education proposed a change to Title IX rules in April that would, in certain instances, allow schools to bar trans athletes from participating on teams that align with their gender identity, but prohibit the issue of a blanket ban. So there can't be a blanket ban, but individual schools can choose to ban. And I'm assuming in that, schools can choose to boycott events where there's a trans athlete and things like that. More people now say they know someone who is transgender, according to the Gallup survey. 39% of Americans say someone they know personally has told them they are transgender, up from 31% in 2021. Americans who know and who do not know a trans individual have become less supportive of allowing transgender athletes to play on the team of their choice, the poll found. 30% of those who know a trans person favor allowing athletes to play on the teams that match their gender identity, down from 40% in 2021. And then those who do not know a trans person, 23% now say they support it, down from 31%. So the rhetoric and the attention around this is working the way the anti-trans folks want it to. And that is because the Maryland governor has declared that Maryland is a trans sanctuary state. We had reported that Washington, D.C. had taken steps to become a sanctuary for trans and LGBT folks. And now Maryland, the state surrounding Washington, D.C., has followed suit with that. Maryland Governor Wes Moore signed an executive order on June 6th declaring the state a sanctuary state for transgender people fleeing other states. The order requires the state to protect all transgender individuals who are seeking gender-affirming care from other states. It prohibits the use of any resources, incarceration facilities, equipment, workforce time, ink to paper, in enforcing subpoenas targeting transgender individuals and their healthcare providers from outside Maryland. So it puts up a barrier to keep everybody safe inside there, including the doctors performing care. Maryland is the 12th state to implement such a policy, a measure that is gaining importance as more states aim to limit or criminalize out-of-state care. Owing to recent healthcare protections for transgender people on Medicaid in the state and this new policy, Maryland has become one of the safest states for transgender individuals in the entire United States. The order outlines several measures Maryland will implement to ensure safety for transgender individuals. It mandates all state agencies to protect those within Maryland who provide, receive, or assist in travel for gender-affirming care. The order prohibits agencies from sharing medical records and shields all care providers and recipients from being compelled to do so. Additionally, it includes a provision that the governor will not extradite any transgender individuals from the state to others for obtaining gender-affirming care for themselves or transgender youth in Maryland. Finally, it prevents doctors from losing their license in Maryland for providing gender-affirming care. We reported on our last episode that a Louisiana senator had voted down a ban on trans healthcare. Then we talked about how that had been reversed by the judicial system in Louisiana. This week, we see more positive news, however, on this front, as a federal judge in Tallahassee, Florida, has issued an injunction against the trans youth healthcare ban Governor Ron DeSantis signed into law earlier this same week. This block allows the 3 transgender complainants in the case to resume receiving their puberty blockers. The main assertion that Judge Robert Hinkle held during the case, a point he established at the outset, is that gender identity is real, and further that the record makes this clear. Hinkle continued later in his ruling that Florida statute ignores the benefits that many patients realize from the treatments and the substantial risk posed by foregoing those treatments. As others also frequently point out, he noted that the same hormone treatments and puberty blockers are used to treat non-transgender children for conditions, so the law is discriminatory by making their use legal for one group of people, but not for others. Next, we head to Arizona, as Arizona Governor Katie Hobbs announced her veto of Senate Bill 1040, a transgender bathroom bill, in a letter to Republican Senator Warren Patterson on Thursday, June 8th, and included a vow to do the same for every discriminatory act aimed at the LGBT community that the legislature sends her way. The bill sought to ban trans students from using bathrooms in public funded schools unless they use the one matching their gender assigned to them at birth. This bill would have also barred teachers from using a student's preferred pronouns without explicit parental permission. It then forces outing of students who are either trans or exploring their gender identity. She had already vetoed SB 1005, which would have made pro-LGBTQ plus schools susceptible to litigation for their support of queer students. After the latest veto, she called for lawmakers to work together to improve equality and freedom in Arizona and drop their efforts to target and isolate marginalized groups. She then directed her attention to the students who spoke out in opposition to the bill, promising, quote, to always be an ally, and thanking them for their courage and leadership. On Friday, June 9th, the Nordic country Iceland joined Canada, Brazil, Ecuador, Spain, Germany, France, Malta, and New Zealand in banning harmful conversion therapy practices. Not a single representative voted against the bill in Iceland. The voting was 53 yes and 3 abstained. So there weren't any no's, but there were some people that abstained. Frederiksen has previously said that conversion practices are, quote, based purely on ignorance and reactionary ideas and have no place in our society, according to the Reykjavik Grapevine. The overwhelming majority voting for the ban in the Alþingi, Icelandic parliament, showed that the legislation was widely supported even after transphobic attempts to kill it. The legislation had cross-party support in parliament despite attempts from known anti-trans hate groups under English influence to oppose it and wrongfully claiming they managed to kill the bill. Their arguments were dismissed as anti-scientific and anti-trans rhetoric. Yay, there's people out there who use logic and reality. The European nation currently ranks 90th out of 100 on Equaldex's Global LGBTQ plus Rights Index, a position that will likely improve further when it's updated to reflect the comprehensive conversion therapy ban. So yeah, they're not listed very highly, but they're doing some good things. So hopefully they move up. Let's continue our international look here as we move to Japan, where a court ruled that a ban on same-sex marriage is unconstitutional. A Japanese court ruled on Tuesday that not allowing same-sex marriages was unconstitutional, a decision activists welcomed as a step towards marriage equality in the only group of 7 nation with no legal protection for same-sex unions. The ruling by Nagoya District Court was the second to find a ban against same-sex marriage unconstitutional out of 4 cases on the issue over the past 2 years. Japan's constitution says marriage is between a man and a woman. This ruling has rescued us from the hurt of last year's ruling that said there was nothing wrong with the ban and the hurt of what the government keeps saying, lead lawyer Yoko Mizushima told journalists and supporters outside the court. She was referring to the ruling in Osaka last year that the ban was not out of line with the Constitution. A Tokyo court later upheld the ban on same-sex marriage, but said a lack of legal protection for same-sex families violated their human rights. Tuesday's ruling was greeted with cheers from activists and supporters waving rainbow flags outside the court. Though opinion polls show some 70% of public supports same-sex marriage, the conservative ruling Liberal Democratic Party of Prime Minister Fumio Kishida opposes it. Kishida in February sacked an aide who sparked outrage by saying people would flee Japan if same-sex marriage was allowed, but the Prime Minister remains non-committal about it and has said discussions must proceed carefully. Now we move on to some entertainment news. In a historic night for non-binary performers, Jay Harrison Gee and Alex Newell win Tony Awards. Jay Harrison Gee, whose portrayal of a gender-questioning musician fleeing the mob in Some Like It Hot has charmed critics and audiences, won a Tony Award for Best Leading Actor in a Musical Sunday night, becoming the first out non-binary actor to win the award. Gee's victory came shortly after Alex Newell, who is also non-binary, won a Tony Award for Best Featured Actor in a Musical, becoming the first out non-binary performer to win a Tony. The Tony Awards, like the Oscars, have only gendered categories for performers, and Guy and Newell agreed to be considered eligible for awards as actors. Another non-binary performer this season, Justin David Sullivan of And Juliet, opted to not be considered for awards rather than to compete in a gendered category. Asked in a recent interview with the New York Times about having been nominated in a gendered category, Guy said, "Wherever I am, I will show up as who I am." I hope for the industry we can remove the gender of it, they added, because we are creators and we should free ourselves beyond so many labels and let the work speak for itself. This past weekend, New York State edged closer to becoming the 13th state to enact a transgender sanctuary law, a critical step toward protecting trans individuals from out-of-state prosecutions. The proposed law, known as A6046B in the Assembly and S2475B in the Senate, delivers broad protections for trans people against legal actions taken in other states, including child custody disputes where one parent is attempting to have the child removed due to them receiving gender-affirming care. If signed into law, this bill will mandate that courts reject the enforcement of child custody orders due to parents' decisions to provide gender-affirming care for their transgender child. It also mandates that the state refuse any out-of-state investigations, arrests, or extradition of transgender patients or providers who manage to reach the boundaries of the New York State if those investigations and arrests are based on receiving or providing gender-affirming care. So it's just basically like, as soon as you cross the line, you're safe. So it seems like very Dukes of Hazzard, where you're just getting chased to the county line, and as soon as you hit that line, like, you know, they have no jurisdiction and can't follow you. Glamour magazine has featured a pregnant trans man, Logan Brown, on its cover in a powerful show of solidarity for Pride Month. Brown was photographed towards the end of their pregnancy for Glamour's digital June cover. The magazine, aimed at women, said the special issue celebrates the allyship that exists between women, cisgender or not, and transgender people through our shared experiences. In the accompanying interview, Brown opened up about finding confidence during an expected pregnancy. His partner is the non-binary drag performer and social media favorite Bailey J. Mills, and Brown became pregnant while off testosterone due to health issues. It was like my whole world stopped, that everything, all my manlyhood that I've worked hard for so long just completely felt like it was erased. He had to get to the point of being confident with who I am and being a pregnant man. Eventually, Brown said he realized, I'm never going to get this opportunity again to, as a queer couple, have a baby that's biologically both ours, which is really special to me, and eventually something just clicked. Throughout his pregnancy, Brown, who was a writer and children's support worker, has focused on educating others about trans parenthood. He started up a blog and wrote a children's book titled In My Daddy's Belly, which follows the joys of two dads awaiting the birth of their baby. Logan also touched on the abuse he and Bailey Mills faced on social media after being asked by Glamour about transphobic comments they suffered from the influencer No Hun, real name Rory Williams. Williams targeted the couple on Instagram, writing "men can't get pregnant" underneath Brown's post and making other derogatory comments towards the trans community. Of course, I'm sure it's all the same stuff that you would expect, and none of it is surprising. Despite what you may have heard, including what you have heard on this very show, and probably even during this very episode, a new study by GLAAD actually shows that support for LGBT plus rights is at an all-time high. In its 9th annual Accelerating Acceptance study, GLAAD found that 84% of non-LGBTQ plus Americans said that they support equal rights for the community, and 70% agreed companies should publicly support us. However, the study revealed that there is significant lack of understanding and familiarity when it comes to non-binary and trans people, with only 28% saying they personally know a trans person. And as I stated earlier, that is in slight contrast to the number we saw earlier, which I believe in that first study we mentioned was 33%. So it's in the same range, but 5% is a pretty big margin of error. But again, we're talking about surveying completely different groups, and who knows what the study is based on and how the question was asked. There's lots of other factors that can go into that. Universally, non-LGBTQ Americans overwhelmingly agree that LGBTQ people should be free to live their lives and not be discriminated against, the organization said. Yet GLAAD knows that a majority of LGBT people have experienced discrimination. There's also universal agreement that schools should be safe and accepting places for all youth, and children should be taught to appreciate and accept people as they are. The report reveals that 91% of straight Americans believe that LGBTQ plus people should have the freedom to live their life free from discrimination, while 96% say schools should be safe and accepting places. GLAAD also said the study directly correlates how the epidemic of anti-LGBTQ legislation and online hate leads to higher levels of real-world harm for LGBT people. GLAAD also argued for heightened representation of non-binary and transgender experiences in all types of media because of the lack of understanding and familiarity. The organization's president and chief executive, Sarah Kate Ellis, said the report's findings were, quote, a clear demonstration that fair and accurate representation in the media could have a powerful impact and measurable effect on the lives of LGBTQ people. However, noting that the U.S. was at a critical junction in terms of LGBTQ plus acceptance and safety. Allyship must turn into action, she argued. Media, content creators, and corporate leaders need to lead and respond to hate with undeterred support for the LGBTQ community, including employees, shareholders, and consumers. Allyship is not easy, but when values and diversity, equity, and inclusion are tested, we must defend them unequivocally. Thank you for listening to this episode of Transverse News. Be sure to check out our other podcasts